міждисциплінарного дослідження «Невидимий батальйон 5.0».
Welcome to the presentation of the Invisible Battalion presentation, where we are going to present results of the research from the Invisible Battalion cycle. This event has been organized by the Institute of Gender Programs, the Legal 100 and NACO. The technical support is provided by the NACO team. My name is Marina Lazarенko. I will be moderating today's event. And in this program, today's agenda, we are going to present the results of our research as well as the follow-up measures that we are going to research. You can leave your questions in the chat or in the comments under the broadcasts on Facebook pages of Invisible Battalion and NACO. This research has been carried out as part of the project on gender equality in the Ukrainian armed forces with the support of Northern Ireland. And I would like to invite Світлана Мусіяка, who is the head of research at NACO. Hello, dear colleagues. Thank you for joining the presentation of our research. And we are happy to share the preliminary results of our monitoring, recommendations, and results of our research from the Invisible Battalion cycle. NACO, as a civil society organization working in the security and defense sector since 2016, has added the gender aspect to the portfolio of its research quite recently. It happened 2 years ago. But we used the relevant tools since the very beginning. And ever since we started to look at gender equality in the defense and security sector more profoundly, we have been able to implement several successful projects, including the methodology of gender audit of budgeting programs in the security and defense sector, the research of career paths of women using the example of land forces. We did not make it public due to security concerns. Recently, we have presented a sociological study carried out together with the Ukrainian Veteran Fund and Rating Sociological Group, where we looked at cases and attitude of the population to vulnerable groups in the armed forces of Ukraine. We continue our advocacy work. We implement communication campaigns, and all of them are aimed at ensuring that Ukraine will have steady progress with gender equality in the armed forces of Ukraine. We are happy to say that our work, our research and advocacy activities are taking place in partnership with strong research initiatives such as this research, which was carried out by experts of the Invisible Battalion project. This is not our first joint research. Another study that we did together was access to military education. And this is research 4.0, which will be presented in the near future. But now I would like to give the floor to the research team, which will present the results of our research and recommendations for the Invisible Battalion cycle. Thank you. Thank you, Svetlana. The Invisible Battalion project was initiated by Maria Berlinska in 2015 and is implemented by the Institute of Gender Programs NGO. This program has been working for 8 years to research the gender equality in the armed forces. And the Invisible Battalion team find it very important that those who defend and protect us feel protected during their service and after it. Every advocacy campaign of this project has always started with research. And this research is, on the one hand, something like a summary, but on the other hand, it can serve as a platform for further development of vectors that require more attention. I would like to thank everyone who have made this research possible, our partners, our experts, our technical teams, but also on behalf of the entire team, I would like to thank the Armed Forces of Ukraine for the opportunity to work on this research at this time. And I am happy to introduce the research team to you. We had the following team working on the research: PhD in sociology, associate professor at National University of Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy Tamara Marценюk, independent gender expert and graduate from the sociology department of Kyivo-Mogilянська Academy Anna Kвіт, independent gender expert Ганна Гриценко, and head of the Analytics and Advocacy Center Марія Звягінцева, as well as analyst lawyers of NGO Legal 100 Victoria Natalia Fatsiyevich and Alla Biloshenko. The majority of the research team are our speakers today. That is why I would like to invite them to speak. Tamara Marценюk, over to you, please. Hello. Thank you very much for your attention to our research. Next, thank you. I will start with the methodological fundamentals of our research. It was carried out between December 2022 and March 2023. I would like to point out that the research period was quite brief, and the research consists of two parts: desk research and field or empirical research. And the purpose of the research was to use monitoring to find successes and challenges of recommendations and research findings from the Invisible Battalion cycle. Here you see a list of our previous studies, particularly the first study, which started everything, which turned into a broader campaign: Invisible Battalion participation of women in the military warfare in the anti-terrorist operation 2015. You will see a QR code later to access it, and our task as part of that research was to identify successes and challenges. Invisible Battalion 2.0, the return of veterans to civilian life. We started in 2018 and wrapped it up in 2019. And the study Invisible Battalion 3.0 on a difficult subject for any armed forces in any country, about sexual harassment in the military sector in Ukraine. We completed it in 2021. Actually, this is the most recent research, so probably the biggest challenge for us as part of this research was to measure successes and challenges following this study, since it was immediately followed by the full-scale war. And the work on this was suspended a little bit. As for the desk research that we did, was interdisciplinary, like in the previous studies. It contains legal and sociological components. The legal component was about the overview of the legislative framework and regulatory framework, the situation with implementation of recommendations from the previous research of the Invisible Battalion cycle. And the sociological component had to do with secondary analysis of statistical information from open sources and analysis of responses to official requests to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Ministry of Veteran Affairs of Ukraine, filed by organizations such as Legal 100, Association of Women Lawyers of Ukraine, Eurofem, and La Strada Ukraine. The empirical part, like in some of our previous studies, was carried out with a combination of the quantitative and qualitative sociological methods. And it was important for us to identify the dynamics of public opinion on gender equality, particularly within the Invisible Battalion 2.0 study. In cooperation with the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, we collected certain information in 2018, and after almost 5 years, we decided to ask the same questions again. This time we worked with InfoSapiens Research Agency, and a bit later I will demonstrate some of the opinion poll results. In addition, over this brief research period, we were able to interview 17 experts on integration of women in the defense and security sector and ensuring gender equality in the armed forces of Ukraine. They included people from the authorities, from civil society, and from the media field. This is a slide where you can see at least a part of the statistical data that we were able to receive. Thankfully, we were able to get it, even though the general information about the proportion of women is and the composition of the armed forces of Ukraine is currently closed, but the Ministry of Defense provided us with data on the number of women in the military, including women among officers, among surgeons, among soldiers, and you can see the dynamics since 2013. You see the growth of the overall number of women, it almost doubled, and we can also see a particular growth of women among officers. We can see that in 2014, when the war first started, we had 1,633 women officers in the army, and in 2022, when the full-scale war started, it tripled. The dynamics of the growth of women soldiers is not as impressive as among officers, but still we see that the number of women is growing, and what is more, women are gradually gaining more access to high positions in the military, overcoming the glass ceiling. I will also show you just a few examples of overcoming the glass ceiling. Since over the past 5 years or so, we have had the first women generals, Tatiana Ostashenko, Brigadier General of the Medical Service, Ludmila Shugaley, Major General of the Medical Service, and Yulia Laputina, who is the Major General at the Security Service of Ukraine. Essentially, we see that despite the fact that the armed forces of Ukraine and the defense and security sector remain quite closed in terms of access of women to high positions, this glass ceiling has been gradually shattering over the past few years of the war, and we hope that this trend will continue.
Якщо підсумувати дуже
I
коротко,
would like to briefly summarize certain aspects of the trends that we can see with regard to the status of women in Ukraine's armed forces over the past 8 years. And as you understand, of course, we have more voluminous information. Because of the shortage of time, we will present only the key findings. I would like to note that the issue of horizontal and vertical segregation in Ukraine's armed forces remains relevant and pertinent, but at the same time, we can point to the amelioration of the situation, and it's in line with the overall international trends. We had a very similar situation with the integration of women in the armed forces of the United States of America and a number of European countries. In the past several years, women have been able to overcome the glass ceiling phenomenon. They have obtained higher ranks. I've illustrated some examples. There are many more of them. And women have also succeeded in holding a number of combat, military, and other specialties. Currently, all the military specialties are open to women, and the current state of play is drastically different from the status quo as of 8 years ago. Marina Berlinska, for example, an intelligence officer, approached our sociological team and requested to explore the status quo of women, because back then intelligence was closed for women, as well as a number of other combat and military specialties. But as we can see, the situation has changed significantly. So we can see some improvements in the horizontal gender segregation in Ukraine's armed forces. In the past, we had so-called traditionally female and male jobs or military and combat specialties, but now the situation is pretty different. The next slide, please. I would like to briefly illustrate a number of examples. So here you can see the findings of public opinion polls. We asked the following question: women should be given equal opportunities on par with men to work in Ukraine's armed forces and other military formations. We can see the findings of diverse public opinion polls conducted by different sociological agencies. But basically, we can see agreement with this egalitarian statement, and the level of agreement has increased in the past 5 years of the war. Like you can see the following answers: fully agree, rather agree. As of January this year, almost 85%, the absolute majority of the surveyed Ukrainian society. So this survey is also representative of the situation in government-controlled areas. So there's agreement with this statement. I also would like to note that since 2018, within our Invisible Battalion project, we consciously decided to steer clear of gender stereotypical statements within our studies. So we employ only egalitarian statements. We don't have statements along the lines of women do not really have a place in Ukraine's armed forces. Do you agree or disagree? By dint of our public opinion polls and surveys, we have an impact on the shaping of public opinions, and we believe that to this end, we need to utilize egalitarian, non-stereotypical, non-patriarchal statements. The next slide. Another interesting question. Once again, let me reiterate that since we are crunched for time, I will show just some of the questions. What is the version of the army that should be implemented in Ukraine? You can see the CMIS findings and the InfoSapiens findings. Conscription of men and women on a voluntary basis, on a contractual basis. This is the answer that received most votes. 66% of the respondents are supportive of this option, and answers among men and women are no different. Conscription of all men and only certain women. We can see that the support for this option is much smaller. Conscription of only men, only 20%. So-called Israeli option, when all men and women are drafted. This option is not really enjoying that much popularity, even though the popularity has increased slightly. These are two different samples, so we cannot really say that this result is fully representative. And what is interesting, that we have very small percentages for the following answers, difficult to say or refusal to answer. So this is something that is not really typical of public opinion polls and surveys. So by and large, the Ukrainian society is supportive of an idea of professional armed forces open to both men and women. The next slide, please. At this point, I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Anna Kвіт. Good morning, everyone. I would like to briefly elucidate the representation of women in Ukraine's armed forces and the visibility of women. So let's have a look at the representation of women service members in the media. The media reflect the current situation in our society, and they also reflect public opinions. In the past 9 years, since the first Invisible Battalion study, very little has changed with regard to the representation of women in Ukraine's armed forces in the media. There's one eloquent act, which is the Day of Defenders being renamed into the Day of both male and female defenders of Ukraine. We can also see some changes in the official communications of the security and defense sector. So this day is not only about men, but also about women serving in the military. We can also see that the chief commander and the president of Ukraine commend women on participation in the military. The role of women is covered not only by our official representatives, but also in the Ukrainian media. And this topic has gained in popularity since the outbreak of the war. If we have a look at the content of publications, there are some positive changes as well. The issue of women in Ukraine's armed forces is analyzed from a more critical and analytical perspective. In 2015, the focus was just on the presence of women in the Ukrainian army and on the fact that some of them were fighting in the front line. In 2022 and 2023, the media have been covering more stories of women fighting in the front line. There's more focus on prospects for career growth and obstacles thereof for women in the military sector. So the publications are more analytical. Even women's publications can be found in female journals. Of course, the focus there is more on feminine characteristics, that women are well dressed, they're well taken care of, they're dolled up with nice makeup at all times. So basically, it's in the spirit of such women's journals. But at the same time, there are multiple stories there of women, how they joined the Ukrainian army and the jobs that they perform in the military sector. On the one hand, women are depicted as feminine and beautiful, but on the flip side of things, they are also pictured as people who know how to use arms, persons fighting, and this is something that is not really typical of the Ukrainian society, or was not typical of the Ukrainian society for a long time. So the military job for a woman is perceived as something normal for Ukrainian readers. So these are civilian women that just decided to join the ranks of Ukraine armed forces. As we can see, over the past several years, the image of a woman service member has become closer and more understandable. It's easier for people to relate to them and identify with them. When we are reading such stories, we can see that it's not something non-feasible for women to become service members. A female defender is a new image that is pretty appealing within the Ukrainian society, and this is something that people start gravitating towards. So we have this familiar and acceptable image of a female defender, but it's a little bit different with female professionals. In interviews, women service members are asked about the conditions of service, but they are not really asked for comments on some other aspects. Next slide, please. it makes sense to have a look at the international obligations assumed by Ukraine with regard to ensuring equal rights and opportunities for women in the defense sector. Ukraine has signed and ratified about 30 main international documents in the area of ensuring gender equality and preventing violence against women. The government of Ukraine recognizes the rights of women as one of the priorities that are on top of our agenda. And there are also some documents that aim at enhancing the protection of women during wartime and afterwards. I would like to elucidate some of the key documents. In 2022, the UN Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women was adopted. And this is something that we drew the attention of everyone in 2020. The ratification of this convention envisages the punishment for discrimination, sexual abuse, harassment, forced abortions, forced sterilization, and some other crimes as well. The Ukrainian legislation is being brought in line with all these conventions, and the Ukrainian government adopted this convention with all the statements and cautionary notes that it's very important to have the relevant legislation of Ukraine adopted, and Ukraine will not really review any provisions that imply any changes in the constitution of Ukraine or some of the other fundamental Ukrainian documents. There's another important document, which is the National Action Plan on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Resolution of the UN, Resolution 1325. Ukraine was the first country to have adopted this document during wartime in 2015. In 2022, during full-scale war, under sirens, missile strikes and shellings, the representatives of the government, civil society, and international society reviewed the second action plan to make sure that this updated action plan reflects the condition of vulnerable populations in the conditions of the full-scale war. So basically, we will have the second national action plan, which is valid until 2025. And the effective national action plan includes the following tasks that are in line with the recommendations of the previous 3 invisible battalion studies. Only several examples to ensure infrastructural facilities and other technical and material resources for women, and to create conditions that make it easier to combine functions and duties in professional and personal lives, to enhance documents that regulate corporate ethics, prevention of sexism, sexual harassment, psychological and sexual abuse, discrimination in the hiring process, performance of job duties, and participation in decision-making, and to create conditions for the monitoring of women being appointed on leadership positions. Ukraine is a country that also ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And Ukraine assumed to perform all the relevant obligations, but currently there was no specific provisions with regard to discrimination against women in the defense and security sector. And the rights of women in the defense and security sector were integrated into the provisions of the last 2 national programs under the auspices of the Ukraine NATO Commission.
The gender issues need to be integrated, particularly the local action plans, the national action plans. But now we are in the condition of a war, and we have due to the war, we have certain issues with the implementation of that. Thank you, and over to the next speaker. Thank you. As Tamara has already mentioned, since the very beginning of the first analytical reports of the Invisible Battalion cycle, a lot of things changed, particularly in the national legislation. And of course, after February 2022, such changes have become even more intense. For instance, the law which increased the number of grounds for dismissal from military service was adopted. It included pregnancy. Also, if there is a married couple in the military, they are one of them is allowed to resign from military service if they have a child. In addition, in May this year, Hanna Mahler announced that all positions are available to women, regardless of the level and rank. At the legislative level, the situation is, of course, not quite as good as we would hope, since according to the regulation on military service, women can be accepted contractually if there are vacant positions that can be taken by women, that can be held by women. This is very similarly phrased in the educational regulatory framework. Now we can say that the situation with the education of officers has significantly improved. In February 2022, the order of the Ministry of Defense was adopted, which opened access to all these officer positions to women. And this order can be found in public access. It essentially amends the basic order, which has a limited use for official use only label. Therefore, since that primary order is for official use only and not publicly available, there may be amendments to that which can quickly worsen the situation. Now the situation appears fine, but the risk remains. Similarly, as for vacations, I have to focus on draft law 5713, which is currently being reviewed by the Parliament Committee. It envisioned quite a few amendments regarding the implementation of gender equality in practice. Some of its positions have lost relevance, particularly regarding paternity leave for men, but some remain relevant, and I would like to point them out. Because now it is still under review and it may still be amended before the second reading. There is a leave on the birth of a child. It is provided to men if they have a child who is born, but it does not apply to military servants. In addition, compensation of additional vacations in the law on social and legal protection of military servants, additional vacations are provided to women who have a newborn child, even though under the labor code, if a person has a child under 15 years or a child with a disability, this additional holiday is available to one person from the married couple, that is either the mother or the father. Anything can happen in life. A mother can be deprived of parental rights. A mother can die, God forbid, and the rights of men who are military servants here are restricted. So this is not just a gender equality issue. It is an issue of gender equality, but it also harms the rights of a child. Draft Law 5713 also suggested using all these guarantees about parenthood and child protection to both men and women. As for 5714, it is about equating their responsibility of men and women in military servants. However, when we held our own a small research, a survey of about 100 of military servants who are both men and women, current military servants and veterans, both men and women spoke about it, but this recommendation can hardly be fulfilled to ensure equal approach to responsibility. As for women's uniform, this recommendation has been voiced in Invisible Battalion research, which includes the uniform and protective equipment, which would take into account the anatomical peculiarities of women's body. There have been multiple cases of fundraising to provide women with the required protective equipment, particularly for women medics who work on the front lines. As for the uniform, maybe you heard that yesterday the new field uniform for women was presented. We have to collect feedback. We have to see how convenient it's going to be for women in the military in practice, particularly women who are in the area of active hostilities. And now women are actively looking at this uniform. And I also have to speak about the strategy of transition between the military and civilian life, since it is highly tied to the previous Invisible Battalion research. This strategy was recently published for discussion. I encourage you to join. And one of the principles in that strategy is non-discrimination for equal opportunities for women and men veterans. And there is also a recommendation for local authorities to develop programs for integration of veterans with regard to gender equality. These are all provisions that have to do with gender equality. There are no other mechanisms which entails a risk that women veterans will be less visible, since the particular needs of women are not taken into account in relevant documents. And if we look at the most recent study of veterans' needs, the focus groups among women veterans, of course, pointed out gender-sensitive approaches to rehabilitation, to provision of medical services. And women veterans also spoke about maintaining their reproductive health, including with the use of assistive reproductive technologies, particularly if they suffered injuries due to their military service. So despite the positive dynamics and positive trends, we need to keep track of the practical implementation of the principles enshrined in the regulatory framework and participate in advocacy of changes and improvements, particularly to increase gender sensitivity even in military service, which has traditionally been a very closed sector. Over to Ганна Гриценко.
Дякую. Давайте наступний слайд, будь ласка.
Thank you. Let's look at the next slide.
Я буду
I am going to speak about the problems of women veterans, about what changed in the veteran sector since 2018, when we started doing this research and held our second research on the problems of ATO veterans. We'll see the dynamics here. First of all, we need to understand that the situation itself changed a lot for us. While previously we said that a veteran could go back to civilian life, the scope of hostilities was limited to a certain territory, and there was civilian life beyond those territories. Now it's very hard to speak about civilian life rehabilitation, reintegration, because you cannot hide from the war anywhere. Maybe in some very small patches of Ukrainian territory, but it is very hard to speak about going back to civilian life because there is very little civilian life left today. And therefore, part of the veteran community have joined the ranks of the armed forces again, which means that the portrait of a veteran is very different now. It is very difficult to say that any research that studied the needs of veterans before would be relevant. Now these studies need to be redone, essentially, because now we are going to have a lot of veterans and we don't have specific information about who is going to get this veteran status as a result of full-scale war. It's very hard to speak about the number of veterans. One estimate is 5 million, but it's hard to say if it's a preliminary assessment or it's a final assessment. These will be very different people with a very different portrait, with very different needs. And in addition, there is a problem that veteran organizations that helped veterans before are currently largely focused on helping the front line, on humanitarian aid to civilians. And therefore, the scope of these veteran services has essentially decreased. The number of veterans who are demobilizing now and who will demobilize later, this number is just going to grow and keep growing. So we have this situation in which we are trying to develop a certain veteran policy somehow. The veteran policy is a difficult issue now. And this slide may be a bit pessimistic, but this is how it is. The statistical portrait of the veteran by 2022 is no longer relevant. And all these databases of veteran services and veteran organizations are also no longer relevant. Previously, the Ministry of Veteran Affairs had a single register of veterans. It's no longer relevant. Some of them may have already died. So
Дуже бракує цього, якби.
There's another thing that is missing right now, and this is something that is noted by experts and the professional community that offers veteran services. There is a lack of understanding of what the veterans policy is right now or what it will be in the future. There's no conceptual approach as such. What is this package of veteran services? What are the criteria for evaluating the quality of veteran services? What is the purpose behind veteran services? We're not really sure what exactly we want to receive as an outcome. There's no prioritization of veteran services. To the best of my understanding, the Ukrainian Veterans Fund places emphasis on supporting veteran businesses and the employment of veterans. This priority is more or less clear in the current context, but still we don't really have a good understanding of the current veterans policy. Currently, veteran services are provided within the paradigm of bed places. Like you have a veteran, this veteran goes to a sanatorium, drinks some mineral water or some herbal tea, does a little bit of physical training and physical rehabilitation, undergoes some treatment, and this is something that is funded from the public budget. So basically the government funds this bed that a veteran occupied for 2 weeks or whatever, but there's no understanding of whether this veteran received high quality services at that sanatorium, whether this veteran received the needed services. And we don't really have a clear-cut understanding of the purpose of these services, because drinking mineral water is more about recreation. It's not really about rehabilitation, be it physical or psychological. So the focus right now is on offering beds in sanatoria or hospitals, but we don't really have a robust understanding of what we are going to do with this large number of people and how exactly we are going to facilitate their return to the civilian life. We have the Ukrainian Veterans Fund. They launched a cycle of surveys on the needs, problems, and concerns of veterans. They are about to launch another cycle of studies and surveys, but all these things are still in the making and they are quite abstract. And now I would like to transition to the issue of female veterans. It's very difficult to discern a gender component here. The gender component should be incorporated into the ready-made policy. So we have a good understanding of a specific policy and we try to single out specific gender aspects. We try to understand what is more needed or less needed for female veterans, or maybe there are some specific needs of male veterans that need to be catered for. So my point here is that right now it's very difficult to single out and prioritize the gender component, and there are a diversity of opinions among experts. Some experts believe that the gender component is not present, even though it should be integrated. Other experts state that there are no specific needs between men and women. We just need to make sure that all the services available will be provided without sexism. Women don't really want to hear the question along the lines of, did you really fight? Did you really serve in the army? So it's important to make sure that services will not be provided on a sexism ground. All these processes are quite abstract at this point. The next slide, please. Therefore, it's challenging to speak on the implementation or lack thereof of our recommendations, because some of these things are not relevant anymore, or are relevant in a different way in comparison with the situation before 2022. If we have a look at our recommendations, as you remember, our study was completed in 2018. Back then, we didn't really have the Ministry on Veterans Affairs. It was one of our recommendations, so the ministry was established. I guess it's one of the key recommendations that was brought to fruition. We also recommended that women have access to higher educational military institutions, because there were large numbers of veterans that wanted to receive a military education and be able to remobilize with higher qualifications. Girls have access to military lyceums right now. Women have been granted access to higher educational military institutions. This is something that is already happening, so women are able to receive a higher military education on an equal footing with men. We had a separate study on this topic. Svetlana referenced it. We will present it a little bit later. There were some problems identified there as well, but by and large, the access is there. There was another problem back then. The veterans female veterans of the Special Operations Forces and the anti-terrorist operation were not granted competent certificates. But over time, the situation ameliorated. So everyone who submitted the relevant documents in several years received this certificate, received this status. I'm not really sure whether the current female veterans after the outbreak of the full-scale war have been receiving competent certificates. There's no certainty there. And there's another positive accomplishment, which is that veterans, female veterans, were included as a separate group into the National Action Plan 1325. This provision is not really secured with the relevant funding, unfortunately, but at least it's a positive thing that this separate group is already there. As for on-the-ground activities, as for how gender-sensitive assistance is being implemented on site, this is something that is done by NGOs and CSOs. The latter do everything within their capacity to be gender-sensitive. They put forward recommendations for diminishing the gender gap, but all these initiatives are being implemented at grassroots level by those organizations that haven't terminated or reduced their activities. At this point, we cannot really say that there's a solid gender component. There are a lot of nuances that still need to be refined. Both governmental entities and NGOs need to put their act together and finalize this work. It's also essential to implement the transition period. It was one of our recommendations back in 2018. This transition period is reflected in the relevant presidential decree, but all the supportive provisions, regulations, and other documents are not in place yet. But at least this transition period exists on the level of the presidential decree. Briefly, that's it with the current state of play. Thank you very much. And now I want to return it to Tamara. Can we have the next slide on the screen, please? To finish off our presentation, I would like to elucidate a challenging topic for Ukraine's armed forces, which is the countering of sexual abuse, sexual assaults, and sexual harassment. We all know and understand that following the Euromaidan, the revolution of dignity, following the beginning of the war in the Donbass, the occupation of the Crimea, we had multiple people who volunteered to fight, and they tried to incorporate two key ideas or values into the Ukrainian armed forces, professionalism and dignity. And these two values are closely intertwined with combating abuse, gender-based violence, bullying, and whatnot. It's a topic that is pertinent to everyone, not only men, not only women, but also men, but more so for women. This study was conducted in 2021, right before the full-scale invasion. It hasn't really been that much time to put our finger on any specific changes. By the way, we decided to use the term sexual harassment because this is something that is part and parcel of our law on ensuring equal rights and opportunities for men and women, dated back to 2005. So this is the term that is utilized in our effective legislative framework. But we need to understand that there is a panoply of forms of violence and abuse. We understand that it's a problematic phenomenon on the labor market of Ukraine. This phenomenon definitely requires more attention, and we really hope that the ratification by Ukraine of the Istanbul Convention will ameliorate the situation. As regards Ukraine's armed forces, it's a big challenge indeed, and the first challenge is stats. We don't really have proper stats on rapes, different forms of GBV, sexual harassment. It's difficult to garner such statistics to start with. But what can we say about some of the changes in the past several years? The upside is that the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine provided a comprehensive response to our request for statistics and request for information on diverse awareness raising and information campaigns. With regard to stats, the response is negative. There are hotlines of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the general staff, and there are multiple other independent call centers. So according to the official information, all these centers and hotlines, they have not received any requests pertaining to sexual harassment or GBV, which testifies to the fact that there's no trust in these services. But at least these services and hotlines are in place, and it's important for the Ukrainian army to refine the reporting mechanism. Our team contributed to this mechanism. This is a work in progress, but because of the full-scale invasion, this process was put on a pause. Nonetheless, it's a very important topic. We received some additional statistics by approaching NGOs and CSOs, which means that both male and female combatants have more trust in NGOs than in their employer, which is Ukraine's armed forces. Our partners, the Ukrainian Association of Female Lawyers, EURFEM, have a hotline. And according to them, 10 out of 200 complaints or reports were received from female service members. And most of these reports pertained to sexual abuse and discrimination. Currently, the EURFEM support service is handling 4 cases related to sexual abuse against women service members. We need to make sure that we have justice in Ukraine in this regard, not only towards women, but on the labor market in general. The security and defense sector of Ukraine is becoming a more and more important part of the labor market. So this is something that we need to place emphasis on. Our reliable and long-lasting partner, La Strada Ukraine, has a well-known national hotline on the prevention of domestic violence, human trafficking, and gender discrimination. And this organization received 147 reports last year pertaining to sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Of them, 2 reports pertained to sexual abuse in military service. One case was about a woman service member being raped during military service, and the other case was related to sexual harassment on the part of a commander during military service. So we can see that not all victims of sexual abuse are ready to report, but the upside is that some of the reports have already been made, so we are trying to break through this wall of silence. And it's of the utmost importance to make sure that the defense and security sector is ready and open to admitting these reports and documenting them. The hotline of yet another partner of ours, the Legal 100, received 1 report from a woman. It was a report related to sexual harassment. So to sum up, I would like to note that this topic is becoming more and more visible. We can see it on the agenda, but Ukraine's armed forces need to do more within their capacity to make sure that their hotlines are utilized.
Що в питанні
Finally,
вирішення
I would like to point out that something very important in the context of gender-based and sexual violence, it's highly important to consider the aspect of education. You can see the results of our information request to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine about what is being done to draw attention to this issue. There are conferences that are being held. We have also joined the education in the sphere of combating the gender-based and sexual violence. In particular, we have developed an online course on gender equality and counteraction to harassment, sexual violence in the military sector on the Prometheus platform. And despite the full-scale invasion over 2 years, this course was able to train over 20,000 people.
Це доволі великий показник, як для
This
такого.
is quite a high score for such a score on such a difficult subject. And it works in particular because the Department of Education and Science recommended that military academies and military educational establishments have included it in their curricula, and statistics confirming this idea is that the average age of the listener of this course is 34, and it is often men rather than women. Mostly men have received these certificates, even though mostly it is women who are interested in such courses, which means that this course is doing its part to prevent sexual harassment and violence in the defense and security sector. And to sum up, I want to point out that these 3 studies that we have mentioned today are available online, particularly on the page of the Invisible Battalion project in Ukrainian and in English. Also, we encourage you to look at our 5th study on the monitoring of recommendations results from the Invisible Battalion cycle. This text is much more detailed than information we were able to present in this brief time frame. Thank you for your attention, and we are happy to see some questions in the chat. Over to the coordinator of Project Marina. Tamara, thank you. Thank you to the entire research team for their work. I already see questions in the chat. I see your raised hands. I will allow myself to provide brief information about our further steps, and then we are going to move on to Q&A. Thank you for your comments and questions. Naturally, this is just some of the results of our research. You can see a QR code where you can find the full version in Ukrainian. The full version in English will be available to download in about a week. Our research traditionally contains recommendations from a group of authors. This research is a joint result of 3 organizations, and we hope it will be useful for everyone working with these subjects. We are planning to continue this cooperation in the future as well, and in this difficult time for our country, we believe the subjects are highly important and relevant. We understand that the opportunities for the civil society to participate are quite limited now, but I am confident that if we join forces, we can do much more. So we encourage everyone to partner with us, because if we share experience, if we share our results, share expertise, and understand how we can empower each other, it will give us an opportunity to achieve good results much faster. I also want to ask Svetlana to share further vectors of our potential work and cooperation, and we are happy to invite you to join our information communication campaigns. And after her comment, we are going to move on to the Q&A section. Svetlana? Thank you, Marina. I fully support your statement that partnership is one of the key factors of success, and this research that we presented today is a result of synergy and joint action by important projects in the defense and security sector. We don't have a lot of projects that have not only existed for over 8 years, but also have successful results and profound recommendations. In addition, this is one of the few projects with a real impact, which is why we are going to continue our activity. As NAKO, in partnership with other civil society institutions, we are going to keep working further, and we encourage other organizations to join us. I can say that there is enough work to be done for everyone, and it is only going to expand in the future. Among the vectors that we are going to focus on in the near future, I would like to mention the support of the National Action Plan to implement Resolution 1325, Women, Peace, Security. This is going to be work on implementing gender-sensitive approaches in military education, in the career path of women in the military, access of women to decision-making in the armed forces of Ukraine. This is also support of the work of gender advisors in the security and defense sector, as well as development and advocacy of amendments to regulatory acts, as well as, of course, information communication campaigns to educate people further. I think this is where we are going to wrap up our main part. So, Marina, I suggest we would move on to Q&A. Thank you, Svetlana. I see that there is a raised hand and we have questions in the chat. I see a question from Ella Lamach. Ella asked a question. Ella, if you would like to say it, I have an additional question. So, okay, then let's wait with separate question. Let's read out your first question. Your first question was about statistical data. Tamara, it is mostly a question to you. Interesting why there are fewer women among soldiers, among regular ranks, while officer positions are more available to women. It is great that the glass ceiling is being removed, but what about the soldier positions? And there is also a question about statistics regarding young people. What model of the army is preferred by young people? Tamara? Thank you very much for this question. Open statistical data is something that is a big challenge for me, and in this case it is difficult to give professional commentary because we don't have the general big picture about the situation with men in the army. As for women and the growing number of women officers, somebody didn't mute themselves. Since the number of officers women officers is growing, it can be explained by the fact that women are engaging more in military education, and they are joining the armed forces with a specific level, specific experience, but we do have a lack of general statistical data. We filed quite a few requests with the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and we were almost unable to receive the necessary information, even though we see that some leaders of the Ministry of Defense do share some information in the media occasionally. And as a sociologist, I want to use this opportunity to deliver a specific brief message, because I was at an international sociological congress where I also presented the results of our research on access of women to the defense and security sector and communicated with representatives of military sociology from other countries. And there is a big difference in professional sociological research on the army, for instance. In other countries, there are military sociologists, civilian sociologists who work on this subject. And there is an understanding of the need for profound research within the armed forces as a structure. Even though we do have sociologists within the Ministry of Defense, but we still see that if such research is done, it is either with the support of international donors, or it is not done at all, or it's very closed. And international standards of research in the defense and security sector are very different. And I really hope that the defense and security sector will become more open to professional sociological research and statistical information. This is also important because we need to understand the trends in the armed forces as a labor market, because that's something important for Ukraine's defense and security. As for the opinion poll, I want to say that young people also mostly choose this contractual army with equal access of women and men to military service. And I think one of the reasons is that young people are people who grew up during the war that has been going on for 9 years. And they have seen how integrated women are in the army, even at the level of visibility. So I feel that in this case, they see a certain professional prospect. So essentially, the responses of young people are not majorly different from the responses of Ukrainian society in general. Tamara, thank you. Let's move on to a question from Irina. Hello, hello to all the viewers, and thank you very much to the experts and researchers for this work. Thank you for your study and for the advocacy that you have been doing. I really hope that today we have armed ourselves with new information, with new reasoning to keep pushing this case, to help the women who are on the front lines now and together advocate for their rights. I actually want to point out that I do see a growth of social support for the participation of women in the protection of the country. I am very happy about the support, but of course, women in the army have several battles that they are fighting, and we can speak about sexism, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence. It is difficult to speak about these subjects, but based on my own experience of communication with women fighters of the defense forces, one of the military medics yesterday said that she is a unit medic and the leadership doesn't let her go to the front lines because she is a woman.
Дівчат, тому що
And we can see that it's a common issue among women and girls. You know, they have this sort of different mission, and it's a testimony to the sexist culture that we need to combat, and we need to put in much effort to overcome this phenomenon. Tamara referred to a large number of people who participated in this independent gender education course. It's a course about sexual harassment in the army, but still, considering the overall size of the Ukrainian army, it's probably only about 2%. I mean, those people who completed the course. Don't you think that there is a need to introduce a mandatory course on gender education in the existing higher educational institutions? So a mandatory course for the military in the first place? Has this issue been raised? And what are the current prospects for introducing such a mandatory course as of now? And I also have a question to Ганна Гриценко. Have you researched, or do you intend to research the discrimination faced by female veterans? What the attitudes are towards them? Because maybe these women competence are being frowned upon. So what is the overall attitude towards them in our society? Irina, thank you very much. To the best of my understanding, Tamara will be the first one to answer the question about gender education, and then we will pass it over to Ганна Гриценко. Irina, thank you very much for your question. Yes, we have this benevolent sexist attitude because there can be a malignant one as well. So we can definitely observe this benevolent sexist attitude during our in-depth interviews and surveys. This is something that we have been observing since 2015. And this phenomenon is a tough one to fight against. Even within the Ukrainian society, there are certain challenges in this regard. I fully concur with you that we need to promote these issues through educational institutions. As for making some courses or disciplines mandatory, it's a contentious issue. On the one hand, of course, we would like certain subjects and disciplines to be mandatory or advisory. But on the flip side of things, I can illustrate an example of a civilian higher educational institution that I represent. Our educational institutions have a certain degree of educational autonomy. So a lot of decisions are made by the institutions themselves, by their faculty. I think it's crucial for the faculty to complete such courses. In the Kyiv-Mogila Academy, we have a person responsible for countering discrimination, sexual harassment, and bullying. So the lecturers, administrative staff, and other staff members of our universities should be aware in the first place. This way, we will be able to avoid some of the problems that we had with the rector of the medical university in Lviv. This is something that should be done, and we are in perpetual communications with the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. We want to bring more attention to such courses. As I have already referenced, this course is already a recommended one. It's also introduced within a number of other projects, and it's also in line with the NATO standards. So it's all about ensuring equal rights and opportunities. It's all about countering sexual harassment. I fully agree with you that education is key here. Within this short time frame, we have already seen some progress along this pathway. So we are improving in baby steps, but it's a relevant topic not only for Ukraine's armed forces. A very similar issue is pertinent in the armed forces of other countries as well. And a lot of armies are implementing endeavors to fight sexual harassment, bullying, and discrimination. I would like to separate these two issues, if it's fine with Irina. So I would like to add something to Tamara's answer, especially with regard to the next steps. I would like to Svetlana to do that. In response to your question about what our future plans are within NAKO, together with our partners, we will definitely place emphasis on this issue. The aforementioned study 4.0, access of women to military education, the findings of this study will be presented shortly. And there you will find more information on the cases of access or lack thereof. You will also find voluminous information there on cases of discrimination and evidence-based approaches to military education for women, inter alia. Within our subsequent projects, we will definitely continue this work, and we would like to encourage all of you to contribute. And I don't want to interrupt Hanna's inputs later, so let me mention one more thing. Quite recently, NAKO presented the findings of a sociological study on the discrimination of vulnerable groups within Ukraine's armed forces. We surveyed some people to explore the attitude of Ukrainians in government control areas, so representative sample, and we also had in-depth focus groups and interviews with the current service members, both men and women. The full text of the study is available on the NAKO's website, both in Ukrainian and English. I will post the link in the chat to make it more convenient for you. Among other things, you will find findings there pertaining to discrimination against women. And I can see a question in the chat about manifestations of homophobia and discrimination against lesbian women. We had some in-depth interviews with the representatives of the LGBTQ community, so it might be of interest to you as well. Svetlana, thank you very much. Over to you, Hanna. Hanna, if it's fine with you, I will be grateful if you add some information on the studies carried out with regard to cases of discrimination against women combatants and representatives of the LGBT community. As regards discrimination against female veterans, we had this study in 2018, so we have a tentative understanding of what discrimination looked like back then. As for the current state of play, we don't really have any additional information. So we're not really sure whether the situation is still the same or maybe there have been some changes. This is something that requires more profound exploration, but at least we have a rough understanding of the existing problems. And some work was done to combat some of these problems. For example, the Ministry for Veterans Affairs ordered recommendations for reducing the gender gap. The recommendations have been crafted, and those organizations that provide veterans services have access to these recommendations, and to the best of my knowledge, there are certain organizations that actively tap into these recommendations. But I'm not really sure whether there are any specific peculiarities right now. Maybe some new forms of discrimination have emerged since 2018. Unfortunately, we don't really have that understanding. We don't really possess that information. With regard to discrimination against representatives of the LGBT community, discrimination is there, but I guess men can feel it more roughly, I think that male homophobia, or to be more specific, male homosexuality is more criticized and frowned upon in our society in comparison with the female homosexuality, even though these are manifestations of homophobia. So we have examples and we have testimonies of bad attitude or snark comments, manifestations of disrespect. So this is something that we can observe not only towards male homosexuals, but also female ones. So this problem is there. It's documented, and a little bit later, we will definitely have some initiatives to combat that. I would like to add something. Some time ago, we carried out another study. We wanted to create a chat bot on the countering of sexual harassment for the military. And we wanted to offer support to the representatives of LGBT. But it happened so that we had enough time to conduct a preliminary study, and then the full-scale war broke out. And unfortunately, that aspect of the chatbot was not brought to fruition. But this topic is crucial indeed. And I've seen some other studies that demonstrate that our attitude towards LGBT military is ambivalent. There is a discriminatory attitude from some people, there's a more supportive attitude from other people, but I think the level of support is improving. I also want to give the floor to Ella, but before I do so, I would like to make another comment. Ella asked us to make some comments in this regard, and a request to make comments on the statement by Hanna Mahler. I'm not really sure that everyone has seen this statement. This is something that she mentioned in one of her speeches. And she said something about the war with a male face, and it's much more challenging for women. It's a hard male work, and there are multiple challenges. Each and every woman has to overcome some of the things that are inherent in us because we are women, but our women are strong nonetheless. Do we see any responses among female service members or female veterans in this regard? And what is our attitude towards the statement? Ella, thank you very much for this question. I think that we need to view this quote and speech in general in a broader context. Are we talking about military service in general or service on the front line? Ms. Mahler said that the frontline service is a challenging physical job, but still women are performing this service on an equal footing with men. Of course, there are some biological differences between men and women, and this is something that we cannot really deny. But it's a different thing that the military profession implies a lot of different aspects, and not all the jobs envisage hard physical labor or frontline service, but that was not really the point in this speech. So I cannot really offer any comments here. In the same speech, Ms. Mahler emphasized that women received access to all military specialties and professions.
Щодо коментарів з боку жінок військовослужбовців.
For comments from women military servants or women veterans, as far as I know, there was no official response or an official comment about these words. Maybe somebody else knows it. Tamara? Anna? Maria, if you have anything to add, do, but I remember my own communication with women veterans, and I remember this phrase that the war doesn't have a male or a female face. It's not a human face at all. And the point is that the objectives of the battle have people who can fulfill them with necessary qualifications. So it's much more about professionalism than about gender issues. All right. I see Ella still wanted to ask a question. Let's move on to your next question. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for your work and for the wonderful presentations. I am in awe of your work. I follow what you do, and I have a question about veterans. Hannah did a presentation on the veteran movement, but the veteran movement also has a new face now. There are more veterans with disabilities among men and women both. There are also more veterans from the LGBTQ community. There are veterans who live in rural areas. Are you carrying out this more detailed research in terms of gender, in terms of some social characteristics? It would be interesting to see not only the gender aspects in the veteran movement, but also other disaggregations. What is our government going to do with these challenges? If we have a veteran who is a man and his wife is unemployed and she comes home with a disability and or she quits, I saw a lot of women next to the rehabilitation centers, and women there say they are shocked because everyone tells them that yes, you're going to take care of your husband. They have to quit their jobs, and businesses are not really inclined to give women flexible work arrangements. And another problem is whether women know how to take care of disabled people. Or what about families where women veterans come home with a disability and her husband has a job which he needs but cannot quit? Maybe it is part of a different research, but I feel like this would be very important, and it would also need to result in some changes to the regulatory acts, to the regulatory framework, so that some veterans can have an easier time adapting. Thank you for your question. Essentially, a social portrait of a veteran and statistics which would reflect all their diversity is the task of the Ministry of Veteran Affairs or the State Statistics Service. I know that the State Veteran Foundation carries out surveys of veteran needs, the response to requests. And they are trying to cover the first wave of the veterans of the full-scale war, but this is still rather the task of these official institutions, because we don't have enough resources to study this big picture, to have this whole statistical portrait done. Again, there are a lot of these people here. We surveyed women veterans whom we know, and we saw a certain spectrum of problems, a certain range of problems, but we were physically unable to reach people who weren't part of our circle. Let's say some people who live in rural areas, for instance, those who don't use social media, for instance. and there are these restrictions there. So I feel that once the Ministry of Veteran Affairs or the State Statistics Service or the Ukrainian Veterans Foundation gets an idea of who are veterans and who their families are, then we will be able to get involved and understand what needs they may have in terms of gender issues. But as a research team, we don't have enough resources to look at this entire big picture. It is more up to the state. Thank you. I see that Anya wanted to say something, and then let's follow up with Tamara. Yes, Ella, thank you for raising this issue. Of course, now it is difficult to speak about what veterans we are going to have, what situations they're going to have in their families. But experience of the previous 9 years of the war shows that veterans in Ukraine encounter discrimination, both men and women, but especially women. The research showed that it is hard for them to access services. Women often get asked, what were you doing there? Nobody told you to go there. Nobody sent you there. I feel like these problems are going to stay present in Ukrainian society as well. But since I spoke about media representation of the military, I want to say that it's also important to speak about, to speak with media and work with media. The media speak very little about veterans, especially women veterans, as well as wives of war veterans. Their problems are largely invisible to the majority of our society. Therefore, we will need to do something larger with society. Until 2022, we didn't really understand the problem of integration of veterans. I would like to add to these issues, I would like to add something positive. When we filed a request on statistical information, the Ministry of Veteran Affairs provided us with much more detailed information than the Ministry of Defense. And even in the Invisible Battalion 2.0 research in 2019, we have a breakdown of veterans by various characteristics, gender desegregated statistics by region, and this is one of the key breakdowns by socio-demographic categories. This includes region, oblast, to see where most veterans come from. And we could see that the Ministry of Veteran Affairs does look at veterans with disabilities as a result of the war. And despite all the problems that have been mentioned, it should be noted that actually when we look at issues of people who acquired a disability as a result of the war, the issue of disability became more visible in general. People with disabilities have become more visible not only as a result of the war. First Lady Olena Zelenska spoke about it as well. She draws attention to the issue of accessible space and so on. So I hope that since veterans are social groups which are quite a visible group, the dynamics is still quite positive, including the dynamics of attitude to veterans over the past few years. And we can see it in the survey results, in opinion poll results. If we saw a slightly hostile attitude to veterans at first, now we see a certain improvement, even at the level of public opinion polls. It is important to understand that veterans are a very versatile group with a lot of different people. We cannot use a universal approach here, and I hope that the situation will further improve in the next few years. Thank you, Tamara. I will add something myself. Ella, the process is complicated as well because there is no single government understanding of rehabilitation for the military. And we need to take into account that there is a major problem with the work with the work of organizations that follow up on the path of wounded soldiers. We are not saying that this is too early to do this research. It is necessary to do, but it needs to be done dynamically. It is not something unchangeable. It is information that needs to be regularly updated. We had another question. Okay. We have run out of time, but we will try to answer them. There is a question from the Invisible Battalion page from Irina Kudrya. I'm curious about the fact that the Ministry of Defense doesn't receive reports on sexual harassment and violence, while Lastrada receives them. Why is it so? Maybe there is a certain distrust in public authorities, or maybe there is a fear of publicity. So I guess this will be the last question that we are going to answer today. Yes, thank you very much. Like I already said, we see that the issue of survivors of harassment and sexual violence are difficult. It is especially difficult to speak about this in the military when it may be their commanding officer who perpetrates this. There has to be a developed mechanism of anonymous reporting, and there is still a lack of this positive experience. There is a lack of solutions on these cases. So, of course, there is a distrust, a lack of confidence that the issue will be resolved, and there is much more trust to civil society organizations which proved with their actions that they successfully resolve, or at least try to resolve, certain issues, that they help with certain judicial issues. So I feel like the Ministry of Defense understands that when there are no reports, it may be a sign that this mechanism doesn't work and it needs more work done.
And we need to remember that the mechanism is not there. We used to have a working group within the general staff. It was a team of lawyers from the Institute of Gender Programs, the Legal 100, and the Association of Female Lawyers of Ukraine. But unfortunately, it was not adopted because of the full-scale invasion. And to the best of my knowledge, the Legal 100 NGO is doing everything possible to review this mechanism and to see whether it's in line with the effective legislation, because the Istanbul Convention has been ratified. I'm really hopeful that in the near future, we will hear more about the implementation of this mechanism. I would like to note another thing. We need to keep in mind that the governmental hotlines, especially within the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, are not staffed with the qualified operators, because basically this job is on top of other duties of theirs. So I believe from this perspective that if you want to receive highly qualified support, then it's better for you to approach the hotlines operated by NGOs. Tamara, am I right? All right, thank you very much. I am immensely grateful to the entire team for their meticulous and hard work. I would like to remind everyone that this study was conducted in cooperation of 3 organizations: the Institute for Gender Programs, NAKO, and the Legal 100 NGO. A big thank you, everyone who joined our Zoom meeting, everyone who watched our stream on YouTube and Facebook. I would like to also remind everyone that we are open to cooperation. We are ready for partnership. Let's join our arms. Let's discuss the important topics, and we need to do everything within our capacity to protect those people who are protecting us right now. I also want to make a note that we've recorded this presentation. There was a question in the chat about a link to the English language version of the presentation. You will receive all the links and associated information following this presentation, so everything will be emailed to you in about 1 week. So once again, a big thank you, everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.